Hi, good afternoon. My name is Alan Hanzl, and I will be doing a presentation on the partitioning of Czechoslovakia from 1938 through 39. I have an exhibit. So basically what we will see are images from that exhibit, probably a little bit less than half of the 112 pages that are in the present exhibit. I'm giving this here at this time because the Society for Czechoslovak Philately is holding its annual meeting here this year. And of course, we have, in addition to my exhibit, we have two others consecutively, starting with frame 9, going through, I believe, frame 28 of the other Czechoslovak related philatelic exhibits. Okay, as you can see from your handout, on the two sides, we have on one a set of, there are two maps at the bottom showing the partitioning process. And above, we have a direct listing of the individual stamps that were introduced during this critical period and that were being, that we will talk about briefly as we run through. The various sections of this exhibit are in chronological order. And so section 1 deals with roughly the 2.5-month period prior to the signing of the Munich Pact, while Czechoslovakia was still whole. The second section deals with the immediate effects, the last 3 months of 1938. The immediate effects of that Munich Pact and also the first Vienna Award. The third section deals with roughly the first 2.5 to 3 months during which the partitioning was completed of 1939. And then sections 4 and 5 deal with the two remaining portions, previous portions of Czechoslovakia that became an independent puppet state of the Slovakia Republic and the protectorate under German control of Bohemia, Moravia, and then a brief 2-page conclusion afterward. All right, the first stamp that was, first set of stamps that was issued in the middle of June of 1938 were the Sokol Summer Games stamps. Here we have an image of one of the co-founders of the Sokol movement, Jindřich Fugner. The stamps, 3 denominations, all single color, all the exact same design. These games were being held in Prague, and the large X is a Roman numeral 10, indicating that this was the 10th such Sokol Games. The cover is just an example. And I'm going to primarily, with the exception of the ceded territories section, I will be primarily just showing the stamps and not the covers. If you wish to see various cover examples, you can certainly go see the exhibit itself. The next shows 2 cedery issues depicting the cities of Pilsen and Košice. Pilsen is in the present-day Czech Republic, and Košice is in the eastern portion of present-day Slovakia. The reason that these stamps were issued at this time is because we were conducting exhibitions. The economic exhibition occurred in Pilsen, much more of an industrial setting or industrial city, and we had a cultural exposition being conducted in Košice. And today, the city of Košice, the second largest of Slovakia, is regarded very highly as the education and cultural capital, if you wish, of Slovakia. The third set of issues really occurred on a single souvenir sheet, the first international philatelic exhibition to be conducted in Czechoslovakia in general, and in Prague specifically, occurred in late June and beginning of July of 1938. There was a single souvenir sheet. You can see of these two stamps, 50 Heller blue on the left, 1 crown red on the right-hand side. And showing, of course, the image of the Bohemian Lion and Praga 1938 to indicate that that particular name of the show itself. This cover you can see is a large cover. It was designed to be used with or in conjunction with that sheet. Now, because the two stamps on the sheet total only 1.5 crowns, and this particular registered cover required more than that, in this case up to 3.60, we have an additional 2 crown stamp in the lower left corner, the Fugner that we saw a moment ago, and a 10 Heller stamp that happened to be a coat of arms stamp from 1928, so that we have the total proper postage of 3.60. So basically what we have looked at are some of the main cities of Czechoslovakia and what was going on in Czechoslovakia during the summer of 1938. What was also going on was the fact that Germany had earlier taken over Austria, and the desire and appeal to have all Germanic speaking and cultural people within the same boundaries was continued to be intensified. And because we had a little over 2 million actually German ethnic people living in what is referred to as the Sudeten area or Sudeten land that you see shaded in yellow, it was definitely something that Germany wanted to include within its boundaries. And so they began to put pressure on other countries to allow them to take over that territory. Well, as we know, Chamberlain and Daladier from England and France essentially signed and at the Munich Pact gave up that portion of land so as to prevent Germany from starting a war. They did not want to have to fight another war. The World War I had ended less than 20 years earlier, and they didn't want to have to go through all that again. So they felt that this level of appeasement would be appropriate. What you also have are other regions. The red region, small region referred to here as Silesia. It was actually the southern or southeasternmost portion of General Silesia. This was actually added to Czechoslovakia way back in 1920, where there had been an agreement with the neighboring Poland so that the Czechs would take over that small region. And the green shaded portion in the southeast, Hungary had felt that they wanted to have all of that land because there were a significant percentage of Hungarians living in it. And after all, that had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, some 20 years earlier. So we have all these pressures coming in to take over parts of land without firing a shot. And each time land is being ceded away, it makes Czechoslovakia, what was left, less defensible. The 3 stamps at the top were created by a number of Sudeten Germans trying to indicate the desire to become part of outright Germany. And so we have this similar image. These stamps were actually, although they were printed, were never actually issued because the Munich Pact was signed and there was no need for them anymore. What we have at the bottom are the Sudeten postal rates, a very abbreviated chart, primarily dealing with postcard and letter rates, just to give you a basic idea of what's happening. Notice that the denomination for all of those rates are pfennigs, PF. The equivalence at the time was judged to be 1 crown to be between 10 and 12 pfennigs. So it gives you an idea of effectively what each of these things would cost. Uh, Within the Sudeten region, Czechoslovak stamps were permitted for use. Initially, it was meant to be designed to be 2 weeks until the 15th of October. But in reality, because of the remoteness of some of the post offices and just to kind of keep things as smooth as possible, they were permitted for use almost to the end of October. So any covers that you see, postcards or envelopes that have a postmark within October could have Czech stamps on them. What you also note from this is the fact that there are special postmarks. A couple things to keep in mind. One, we have a design clearly of the swastika appearing in 2 of the postmarks. This is generally an indication of things like, to the ethnic Germans, we are free, or you are now free, even though you are living within a region that had not been part of Germany, but now you are. The postmark portion, the one to the far left, gives you an indication of how the names, the German names of the towns, replacing the Czech names, were often used. This particular city, Vidnova, was the Czech name for Wiedenau. So therefore, postmarks would have to reflect that. And we will see that over and over again in the occupied territories. Here again are 2 more examples of all Czech stamps being used and different kinds of postmarks. We see here at the toward the bottom, in between the Košice stamps, we have a Day of Liberation. Here we also have a mixture. Now, a mixture of mixed franking during this not quite month period was frowned upon, but the reality was that they wanted the Czech stamps to be used up and be done with already. And so again, you will have covers like this that will have a combination of Czech and German stamps. Notice we have special postmarks on both. And even on the top cover, the left-hand stamp has kind of a local special marking on it. So all kinds of special markings to try and indicate we are free and we are now part of Germany after all. There are 6 regions that are still listed in the catalogs, in the European catalogs, that indicate various kinds of overprints that were applied to Czech stamps that were still in post offices as quickly as possible within each of the regions. Here you have the German names of 6 cities and the number of stamps that were overprinted. The smallest number, Ash, only had 5 stamps, and there you see them all. And the nature of the overprint was simply a denominational change to cover what had been before. There are 3 Czech coat of arms issues, the first 3 to the left, and then 2 portrait issues depicting the first 2 presidents of Czechoslovakia, Beneš to the left, the second president, and Masaryk, who was very much like our George Washington. The postcard to the bottom is showing, an effect of that the relationship of Germany overtaking the region, and the little shaded portion, of course, is for the most part been gobbled up. Here are examples of other types of overprints. Here we have Reichenberg and Rumberg. Typically, it was a Virsy Frei above a swastika, and the bottom cover shows how some of these stamps were used, and then various overprintings would be done with special postmarks. There's even one that is on the district court symbol because that particular envelope was mailed from the district court of Česká Komunice. Again, some more examples of mixed franking. And again, special frankings, special kinds of postmarks to indicate the control. And in both cases here, the 1 crown equaling 10 pfennigs meant that both of these covers were appropriately franked or correctly franked. In early December, December 4th of 1938, Germany issued 2 semi-postals referred to as the, to show the celebration, I should say, of the Sudeten referendum. The Sudeten referendum gave any ethnic Germans the same rights of any Germans living in Germany. That is so-called voting rights, taxing rights, any other kinds of rights whatsoever. The non-German ethnics, for the most part, the Czechs obviously did not have or did not were not able to have the same life benefits. The bottom covered just a series of again mixed franking with some special cancellations. So we have those 2 semi-postals. The additional charge for the semi-postal was meant to be money toward the Germans that had been living in the Sudetenland all along to help them acclimate. Here we have the 2 copies of the same style postcard. The top one was actually mailed, and because it was a 6 pfennig postal card, that is to say the right stamp was already the printed image on the card itself, and there was 12 pfennigs required, an additional 6 pfennig stamp to its left had to be applied. The bottom is another copy of the postcard, but it's a mint one because it was never used. I put it here so that you could see what the image was, and so that I could maintain the same size as the original postcard as well. You'll notice how the map is of the Sudeten area is indicated, and we thank our leaders is the phraseology at the bottom. Okay, now we move to the Silesia portion, which was given to Poland. And effectively, it was given to Poland within the first couple of days after the Munich Pact was signed. So this small region was effectively occupied by Poles within the first roughly 9 or 10 days after and including October 3rd. During this particular period, Czech stamps were only permitted for use for a few days, and then it had to be Polish stamps. Here, of course, we're dealing with the grozies as the unit of financial measure within Poland. This particular purple color stamp was issued on the 11th of November. It was a 25 grozy stamp, which would have been suitable for mailing a letter, a domestic letter under 20 grams. And this is what we have as an example cover. This stamp shows a liberation. Again, the whole idea of liberating people. This time, because it was the Poles taking over, it's the Poles saying, we Poles are liberated from those nasty Czechs that took us over in Silesia. The third region was the southern part of what we now refer to as Slovakia, or we know as Slovakia, and this is where Hungary stepped in. They were not permitted to undertake the invasion until sometime later, really the 2nd of November, until after a second agreement was signed. So even though the Munich Pact set it in motion, it was the first Vienna Treaty that actually gave license to Hungarians to invade. So once again, we're going to be dealing with 2 main ideas. Number 1, Czech stamps will be permitted only for a limited period of time. And secondly, there will be various kinds of postmarks indicating liberation. Now this is liberation of Hungarians. from those nasty Slovaks. And the town or city councils will now be reflective of a Hungarian name and not the original Czechoslovak name. So here we see a cover that was mailed from Košice, but the Hungarian name for it, Kassa. Here we have two covers that were in which Hungarian stamps were used at the beginning of 1938. 38. Hungary issued, I believe it was a 14 stamp set celebrating the 900th anniversary of St. Stephen's. And so these two stamps here are two of those from that 14 stamp set. You will notice again, the Hungarian names for the cities. And what you also notice is either a large circular at the bottom or kind of an oval shape covering the top stamp. We have what is referred to as a Visitor cancel, and I'm sure the pronunciation is a little different than that, so forgive me for that. But Visitor meant homecoming. In other words, Hungarians were now, welcomed back into the home of Hungary. At the top, we have just a card. It wasn't actually mailed at all, just to show the nature of the overprint. Again, the Visitor as well as one of the local cities. At the bottom, there were two stamps that were as part of the St. Stephen's set. That were overprinted Hazaras on the 1st of December of 1938. Again, this was an idea of return to homeland. So again, another symbol on already existing Hungarian stamps. What you see in the chart was a period of time within the dozen cities listed there, during which the special Visitor cancellation had to accompany the stamp as well as the local town cancel or local city cancel. And I give a comparative naming to both the Hungarian and Czechoslovaks names. Okay. Now, during this last 3 months of 1938 period, the remaining Czechoslovakia did issue a couple more stamps. The first was an updated version of the portrait issue of Milan Stefanik. The difference between the two stamps is the denomination is 50 Heller, whereas before, 3 years earlier, we had just the plain 50. And you can see the design of the stamp is a sharper, clearer image. That is to say that steel plates were probably used to print this that were in much better condition than those from the earlier period. Also notice that the stamp was issued on the 21st of November, 1938, and was valid until the middle of December, 1939, so for a little bit more than a year. This validity was in what would become the protectorate, or the remaining Czechoslovakia. It was actually because Stefanik was a well-known Slovak figure. This stamp was actually permitted for use within Slovakia for another 7 months after that, well through July of 1940. The only other stamps that were issued during this 3-month period, the Czechoslovak 20th anniversary issue. Now, the key story behind this is that originally Czechoslovakia, prior to the Munich Pact, was getting ready to celebrate their 20th anniversary of existence, and they were hoping to issue these stamps and that small mini sheet that you see next to it as a celebration of 20 years of independence. Well, because of the Munich Pact, there are a lot of people that suddenly weren't independent, they weren't independent anymore. And so the backing, the justification for these stamps as a 20th anniversary was that of postage stamp issuance, not of independence, which is why it was delayed from late October into the middle of December. The mini sheet came out first on the 15th of December, and then 3 days later, the two individual stamps. The blue and tan stamps are 2 and 3 crown. The mini sheet stamp was also a 2 crown of the same design, but that mini sheet was actually sold for 10 crowns. The additional 8 crowns was meant to give aid, the funds collected from that, to give aid to the Czechs that were hoping to leave the Sudetenland area and go into the remaining, at that point, still free Czechoslovak area. And there we have a registered air cover showing all 3 of the stamps at the bottom. All right, now we take into the first 3 months, 2.5 to 3 months of 1939. And now the map is going to change yet again. You'll notice that Czechoslovakia will no longer appear on any maps after the 15th of March. Instead, we have the various pieces, the shaded ones that we had from before, and the Bohemia-Moravia Protectorate, and the Slovakia independent nation. Now, this independence took a little while to happen. The Slovak parliament met on the 18th of January, 1939, to begin to negotiate the specifics, primarily with Germany and also with Hungary, to establish the boundaries and the nature of their independent state. By breaking away from Czechoslovakia, obviously was going to make it that much weaker, but Slovaks had really always wanted their own independence anyway. They had been merged with the Czechs back in 1918 because they felt it was important to do so. There was greater safety in numbers then. Well, by this point, that safety in numbers was gone. And Hitler basically said, if you declare your independence, I'll leave you alone. Don't worry about the rest of it. I'm going to take it over anyway. So the negotiations and such ended up being some 8 weeks because the Slovaks were not getting what they had hoped for. And so we have the overprint on the 1936 scenery stamp. The various lines of the overprint indicate Slovak assembly opening. Then it gives the date of the 18th of January. We have a little Slovak coat of arms, and you'll notice that the denomination has been changed from the original 10 crown to 300 heller, or the equivalent of 3 crown. Okay, and we'll keep in mind all of what's happening with that map. Here's an example of the use of that particular stamp on a specially designed cover that had one of the chain breaking issues that we saw from the 20th anniversary. The next stamp that was issued was originally ordered by the Slovak parliament. They wanted to continue to honor Stefanik, but they wanted to have a stamp created that was going to be used only in Slovakia. And so therefore they borrowed the same portrait image from the 1935 stamp and simply changed its color. Everything else about the stamp essentially remained the same. The irony is that the stamp would only be valid in Slovakia for a very limited period of time and would not be permitted for use in the protectorate as a Czechoslovak stamp after 1939. We have a, and again, keeping in mind when it was actually issued. Here we have a postcard with 2 of the Stefanik stamps. There was also the portrait issue of Masaryk. Here we have a couple of changes involved in the design. Obviously, there's no color change, but what we do have is a hyphen that is placed at the top between Česko and Slovensko to help indicate that there is a separation happening. Again, this stamp was requested much earlier, but would not actually be issued until April. The other difference is we go from the Slovak crown, from the Czech crown, 1KC, now to effectively the new Slovak crown, simply 1K. After all, the Czechs won't need crowns anymore because they will be taken over completely by the end of the year. Okay, meanwhile, in the far eastern portion of Czechoslovakia, referred to as the Carpatho-Ukraine area, we have that is populated primarily by the Slavic group, the Ruthenians. They began to see what is going on in the rest of Czechoslovakia, and they decide that what they're going to have to do is to declare their independence. They're not going to be able to get any aid from the Czechs in the West. Slovakia has now declared its independence, so we're cut off. We better declare our independence. And so they did on the 15th of March. There was only one stamp that was ever issued. It was actually printed in Prague some days earlier and sent. What would happen here is that Hungary was then given license to take over this Carpatho-Ukraine region on the very next day, on the 16th. Hitler decided there should be no Czechoslovakia whatsoever left. And so therefore, Hungary, go ahead. It's all yours. It was yours 20 years before. Now it's yours now. So as a result, this stamp was only valid for one day. It was because there were many of the printed stamps were still in Prague. You will find examples where it would be in use for a total of 3 days through the 18th of January, but very, very limited use. Here is a cover that shows a Carpatho-Ukraine stamp in the upper left, in effect a Slovak stamp that was created during the overprint in the lower left. You have a German stamp kind of in the middle next to the 20, and a Czechoslovak stamp. So we have all sorts of interesting mixed frankings going on in various regions during the limited period of time. Okay, so now, again, going back to the second map, you recognize that Czechoslovakia no longer exists. And so therefore, within the protectorate that was created, Czech stamps were permitted for use for 9 months until the middle of December. And so what we have here are Czech stamps in use on a cut square and on a cover. But notice we start to see some special cancellations. Here we have an example of one that was mailed on the 20th of April. This was celebrating, this particular special cancellation was celebrating Hitler's 50th birthday. I included this particular postcard because it was mailed to a suburb of Cleveland, not very far from where I grew up. But again, we have Czech stamps being used, and we also have a chart of the postal rates. Notice that we're dealing in a crown style at this point, just single K. Okay, here we have an airmail stamp, and the interesting story about this stamp is that for many years, until only about 10 years ago, this appeared in Scott catalogs and in various other catalogs as well as a Czechoslovak airmail stamp. It was C18 in the Scott catalog. And only recently did they change this to call it C1 of the Bohemia-Moravia Protectorate, because the stamp was not, even though it had been designed and was ready for use back when there was a Czechoslovakia, It was not released until April, when there was no longer any Czechoslovakia. The other element of this particular stamp, there is a hyphen between Česko and Slovensko in the name at the very bottom border. The design itself had actually dated back to 1930, I believe the initial set was, but they needed an additional 30 Heller denomination stamp, which was why this was to be printed in the first place. And here we see an example of a cover and its reverse side, shrunk down somewhat, in which we have four on the reverse side and one on the front, uses of this particular airmail stamp. I kind of like this particular cover because it went quite a path to get to Quito, Ecuador. We have all sorts of cancellations here, but the other issue is the fact that we're beginning to see a considerable amount of censoring. And we have a bilingual censor tape on the right-hand side of the reverse side, and we see other designations of censoring. You have at the very top portion of the front of the cover, this little circular cancel DK Dezakova Controlla, which indicates that it is passing through scrutiny, careful scrutiny. Even though check stamps were permitted for use, those that were still left in the post offices at the time when they were taken over, the Germans decided that they ought to be overprinted, and the overprint would consist of two main portions. One would be three horizontal lines that would obliterate the top Czechoslovensko designation, and then a bilingual reference to the name of the protectorate. So we have the German name on top in control and the Czech name on the bottom. So there were a total of 19 stamps. Here we see the first 9, the lowest denomination, 5 of the coat of arms, and 4 of the portrait stamps. The 10th one was the Pilsen that we saw before. The nature of the overprint, things are a little closer together because of the size and orientation of the stamp. But again, the main elements of the 3 horizontal lines and the bilingual name are there. We now have the other 9 were scenery issues. Here we have the 6 smaller ones, and here we have one of the larger ones and the other 2 of the larger ones. Anytime you do overprinting, especially when you do it in a hurry, there are chances for error. And in fact, there were several errors. The most common errors that still remain listed, although the number of these has changed over the years, is the lack of the dot after the U in Bowman Umaran. And we have 6 issues that have that missing dot that you see at the top. What I've done in each case is, along with the natural stamp that has that error, I also do a blow-up version of the portion, so it is a little easier to see the fact that the dot is missing. Here's, of course, the only stamp. Here we have the lower left stamp with the error, and so on with the other 3 as well, as you can see. The next pair of stamps is not only missing the point after the U, but is also missing the U itself. So that occurred on the 20 Heller as well as the 25 Heller. Finally, the one error that has remained in the Scott catalog is the one in which the R in Maren has been replaced by an N, as you can see here, on the 1.60 crown stamp. I think it's 16A in the Scott catalog. So anyone still recognize, the other catalogs still have many of the others, the European catalogs. At one time, you should know there were as many as 19 of these errors listed. All right, what I want to make reference to in terms of these 3 large stamps is the fact that they were printed in consecutive arrangements of 16 by 7, in which 16 by 7, of course, is 112. So we have 100 stamps and we have 12 coupon areas that are the shaded part. These coupon areas were generally totally blank. The first stamp set that Bohemia Moravia actually issues with its own name is the Castles, Churches, Castles, and Cities group, or scenery issues, if you wish. And here we have the 4 smallest denominations. These were printed in 10 by 10, next to 5 by 10, next to another 10 by 10 and 5 by 10 arrangements. So one run through the press would give you 300 stamps. The next larger group, here we have 2 scenes, just 2 different colors of Bruno and Olomouc. The difference here is that once again, we have the printing done in the 16 by 7 arrangements. However, the 12 blank coupons vary. In the left half, you can see the 2 column of 6 and 6, as we saw a moment ago. But in the right grouping, we have pairs around 6 different pairs around the borders of the 16 by 7 arrangement. And that, of course, creates some interesting collecting possibilities. What these also had were plate markings. They were 8-point stars. They came in 2 styles, in which the interior of one was also an 8-point star. So in geometry terms, similar figures. And the other was an interior cross or a 4-point star inside of the marking. The coloring of those marks was the same as the coloring of the stamps themselves, the single coloring, whether it was the purple or the red or the green or the blue. 3 more denominations, the highest of the group, were all of the classic scene of Prague, in which you include the Prague Castle in the background, and you have the Charles Bridge in the front. And I only included those as there are actually 2 other denominations in between, but since they were issued after the 31st of August, I did not include that in terms of the exhibit or in terms of the presentation. The other stamp set that would become very popular with Czechs was the linden leaf set. It is very much like the national tree. We have the same design effectively in various colors and denominations. And each of the denominations has 2 shades to go with it, except for the bottom 4. So you have a lot of variety in terms of the printings. You also have a variety in terms of the 1 in 10. The serif is larger on some than the others. And finally, out of the Bohemia Moravia group, we have a set of newspaper stamps that were issued on the 25th of August. Much the similar design from before, from the, I believe, the stamps in 1937. But the difference, the newspaper stamps, but the difference is, of course, we have the bilingual naming at the top and bottom, as we've seen with the other Bohemia Moravia stamps. What I'm showing in the bottom left corner is the nature and the way in which they were printed. I took, even though the printing grouping was a 10 by 10 arrangement, I focused in on the bottom blocks of 4, lower left and lower right. On the lower left side, you would have a number anywhere from 1 up to 12. In the lower right, you would have, in this particular set, all 39s, representing the year in which these stamps were issued. You'll notice that from the chart, I'm showing all the possible combinations of these markings. So most of them only have a 1 or a 2 in the lower left corner, whereas the 5 Heller which was used by far the most, printed by far the most, and it was used because all of the printed matter rates, postal rates, were multiples of, for the most part, were multiples of 5 Helen. And so therefore the use of these stamps was going to become the greatest. So that's why those lower left numbers go from 1 to 12. What I want to show here in this last little section of Bohemia, Moravia, here we have 2 sheets of philatelic souvenir sheets. One was issued in 1937 when Bratislava hosted the exhibition. It was kind of a regional philatelic exhibition. And the bottom was the 1938 Prague sheet that we saw before. But you may recall that both of the bottom sheet, certainly you would remember that you only had the Praga 1938 and the 2 stamps and a small crest at the top. Well, what a number of people did here in the United States, particularly in the New England area, is they decided to get as many of those 2 souvenir sheets as they possibly could, and they would overprint them. In the top, you would have an enlarged crest. Turns out it would come in any one of 6 different colors, red, green, blue, black, and silver, gold. And the bottom would have a designation as to where and when these particular specially overprinted stamps would be sold. So the first time that they were sold would be in the New York World's Fair. They would have no postal value whatsoever, certainly in the United States and no place else. By the time the fair opens, Czechoslovakia no longer exists. And so these are meant as a, in effect, a decorative kind of thing in which these are almost like semi-postals, except they're non-postals because all of the funds collected from the sale and from the overprinting would be used to fund the pavilion, the national pavilion that had originally been designed for Czechoslovakia at the World's Fair. Remember, this was the fair to designate peace in the entire world. Well, yeah, we can see what's cooking there. Here I'm showing a pair of Bratislava sheets, but I'm showing the crest, gold and silver. And what I'm also showing is, in addition to being used in New York, it was also used for the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto, which I think was just 18 days long in late August and early September. So we've had the New York World's Fair opened in April, so we've had quite a few months of these sheets, and they decided, boy, wouldn't it be a great idea if we could sell some of these in Canada as well to create additional funds for a pavilion at the Toronto exhibition. Those that weren't sold in Toronto would then be crossed off and overprinted yet again to be sold at the remaining portion of the New York World's Fair in 1939, which extended a few weeks after the Canadian exposition had closed. And I've only done the 1939 ones because that was the limitation of this exhibit. But you need to know that these were also done in 1940 at the New York World's Fair in a very similar fashion. The overprints would be the style of the text at the bottom would be very much the same, but would show 1940 instead. And there are all sorts of interesting errors and combinations of things that are worthwhile collecting and are prized. All right, let's now turn to the free puppet state of Slovakia. Initially, Czech stamps were going to be permitted for use, but again, on a limited basis. And so what we were going to do is to overprint them as quickly as possible. And so we have a Slovenský štát 1939 overprint. This particular set is of 22 stamps. So the 19 that were provisionally overprinted in the protectorate, plus 3 more. So here you see the style of the overprint as it was executed on the 5 coat of arms and on 6 of the portrait issues. Here's a cover that shows the use of several of them. And we have at the bottom the Slovak postal rates, again, for this period. And you've got the charts on the reverse side of the sheet so you can make the necessary comparison. I just displayed this cover real quickly because it gives evidence to what the common man was feeling like within Slovakia. This gentleman, last name of Wurm, W-U-R-M, is sending this letter to a person in New York City with the same last name, but he says, I'm pretty sure you're not really a relative of mine, but just simply a namesake. And the reason that I'm writing you this letter is that I would like for you to give me an affidavit of support so that I can leave this newly created nation and come and live in the United States. In order for these people to come, of course, they had to be sponsored. And this was, in effect, a request for this kind of sponsorship. So you already have people from within this new puppet state that really don't want to be there. To continue with the Stadt overprints, we have the diagonal versions of the higher denominations. These are all on the scenery issues. And here we have a total of well, it grounds out the 22 total altogether. Okay, notice the bottom 3 larger ones. We have the same printing design, 16 by 7 with 100 stamps and 12 coupon areas. Oh, one other thing I do want to point out on these diagonal overprints, notice what a short period of time they were valid. Not even 4 weeks. Because there were going to be other stamps, there were going to be Slovak stamps coming out very soon. The lower denominations were permitted for a longer period of time because they knew there were more of them out there. There's an example of a cover using both styles of the Stadt overprint. And basically what I'm showing here were a chart of the plate marks that existed on the various denominations. Typically, they were 1 and 1A. Of course, I'm showing here one of the exceptions of 3 and 3A for the 1 crown Masaryk stamp. This becomes the first stamps issued, first design. We'll talk about the actual date of issuance in a moment. These stamps depict Hlinka, who was a significant, Andrew Hlinka, who was a significant political and religious figure in Slovakia, really dating back into the teens, 20s, and 30s until he passed in 1938. So very much a renowned figure, both as a statesman and as a religious person. They were to issue these 2 stamps. The 50 Heller and 1 crown stamps were so denominated because that would be the domestic rate for a postcard and up to a 20-gram letter. The Germans saw this and said, nope, you can't issue that stamp. What's wrong with that stamp? Well, what's wrong with it is at the top, Czechoslovakia. You are an independent nation. You have no ties with Czechoslovakia and with the Czechs anymore. So what you need to do with this design is you better at the very least overprint them. We prefer you not issue them, but overprint them so that it is very clear that it is a Slovak stamp. And so we have that diagonal Slovenský Stát overprint that you see on the 2 stamps. You'll notice that what I've done here is the lower left corner, block of 4, shows the plate marking of the A1 and the date that stamp, that denomination was initially issued. The 6th of March for the green and the 10th of March for the red. Right around the same period of time, we get the first Hlinka regular issue. The critical difference here is these are acceptable. The images are very similar to what we saw a moment ago, but it's Slovenska Posta at the top. No more linkage with the Czechs designated whatsoever. So we have 8 denominations. We have 8 stamps that are perfed, and then 2 that are imperfed, not perfed. And here I'm just displaying 3 of the lower left blocks of 4 that show the A1 plate markings, similar to what we saw a moment ago, along with the date that that particular denomination was first issued. And you can see from the chart that there is a slight variation in that first day of issuance, although by the end of March they were all in, printed and distributed. Slovakia also during this period issued a set of newspaper stamps. The initial one was overprinted Slovenský Stát over the original Czech stamps, but soon after that, by June 1st, they issued their very own set, very much the same denominations and colors, but their own design. And finally, the last stamp to talk about is the Stefanik regular issue, which was issued on May 4th of 1939 and was valid for only 1 day. Why? Because the Germans didn't like the design of this stamp. What part didn't they like? They didn't like the fact that Stefanik, who was a member of the French army in World War I, is pictured in his French uniform. They didn't mind the cap as much, but they really hated to see that full uniform. And even though the Germans were not at war with France on May 4th, they just didn't like that reference to something Western. You are an independent nation. You don't give any evidence of linkage with others. Okay, so what we have here then is a cover at the bottom showing the stamp was the cover was mailed on the 3rd of August, and say, wait a minute, those stamps weren't valid anymore. Well, they were mailed on the basis of the fact that we have the 2 red 1 crown stamps that were used and the postmark covered. That was limited to the fact that we only needed 2 crowns to send the letter in the first place. So the top part was for decorative purposes only. Those stamps the Stefanik stamp set were reissued, but they were reissued as stamps that you could not use, was simply meant as decorative. So in conclusion then, we've got 2 key points. We've talked about the full separation, partitioning of Czechoslovakia. It would not be reunited until the conclusion of the war. And in fact, it would be a full week and a day after Germany surrendered, when the reunification became official. The very first set of stamps that they issued a week after that was the linden leaves design that had been popular within the protectorate. So they kept it, obviously now with Czechoslovensko at the top, in 9 denominations. This, of course, was done in 1945. Well, we get to the period, of course, communists eventually take control. And so when they finally lose control in 1989 through 1991, and Czechoslovakia now becomes, in effect, a free state again, the Slovaks decide they want to be separate once again. And so a peaceful separation was negotiated. And on January 1st of 1993, they were in fact 2 republics that exist today. Both republics, of course, celebrated their 30th anniversary at the beginning of this year. I am simply showing here the first stamps that were issued by both republics, the 3 crown Czech Republic stamp and the 3 crown Slovakia stamp. 3 crowns appropriate because that was the postal rate for letters up to 20 grams. And so that is the conclusion. So they are separate again, but this time peacefully and without duress. Thank you.